Okay, so I think I'll open with a sort of just brief introduction about, well, not who I am, but why I'm here. You're all connected by knowing Johannes, I imagine. So I'm from an organisation called the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is an international organisation, started in America, in Chicago. It was sort of came out of the anti-war movement in the wake of the Iraq War. So our kind of mission is to investigate what we call the death of the left. So that's our provocative slogan: is the left is dead, long live the left. And we'll probably get into more of what that means later on, but yeah, and the way we try to do that is not is primarily, we're primarily an intellectual and educational project. Okay, so we run reading groups, which is how I've come to know Johannes and Patrick and Jacob, because they're all attendees in the reading group. But we also do other things such as publish a journal. We put on panel events and various other activities. This is quite a non-standard thing for us to do. Normally our audience is kind of mainly students, right? So this is somewhat different. And the relationship between Platypus and Johannes' organisation is sort of new and a little bit experimental. So we're trying something slightly different here. Yeah. So maybe I could say a bit about what the kind of goal of all these activities is. So we think of ourselves as a pre-political organisation. What that means is that in some way we think the time isn't yet ripe for politics proper. So we think that the attempt to kind of apply Marxism in the present day as if it was as true as it ever was is somehow ends up distorting it and making it mean something different. So what we're trying to do is work through this. We're trying to understand the present historical situation, which we understand as being the main thing that characterizes it is that the left is dead. So we're trying to kind of work through that and understand that. And that's why we're putting on all these activities. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say more about that in the Q&A. So I want to begin with the opening sentence of perhaps the most famous work of Marx and Engels, which is the Manifesto of the Communist Party, published in 1848. And I'll probably assume that if you've read anything of their work, it will be that, because that's what most people start with, unless you're brave enough to have dove into Capital immediately, which I think is actually a really unwise decision, but it is what many people do. So the manifesto opens with the claim that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And I think it's a good general rule that when a phrase becomes famous enough, we need to be suspicious of the received account of its significance. And I don't think this is an exception. Marx and Engels are often credited with discovering a scientific theory of the development of human civilization, according to which the struggle between classes is the motor that drives history along. And this is a direct quote from the manifesto. Free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, that's categories from the Roman Republic, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman. All these are relationships between oppressor and oppressed, and it's the conflict between them which leads to large-scale changes in the form of society. This is the so-called materialist theory of history and social development, which is commonly seen to be the great contribution of Marx and Engels to modern politics and thought. It is materialist because it supposedly explains human activity and social change in terms of the economic interests of conflicting social groups. But Marx himself was keen to emphasize that the concept of class struggle was not his own discovery. In 1852, Marx wrote to his friend and editor, Joseph Wedemeyer, that no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. Two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. It could seem that here Marx directly contradicts what he'd written to Engels, what he'd written with Engels a mere 5 years earlier. Here Marx talks of class struggle as a particularly modern phenomenon, rather than something that was eternal throughout all history and that explains the development of all civilization. But as we shall see, this is a perspective that remains constant throughout their work. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, partly to demonstrate that this is something that is there throughout. In his 1878 book, Anti-Düring, and that's a polemic against the contemporary socialist who isn't really known anymore. Düring was his name. The work which did more than any other to popularize Marxism amongst the growing socialist movement. Engels wrote that the first working class rising had taken place only at the very beginning of the 1830s with the revolt of the silk weavers in Lyon, and that the first national, as opposed to merely local working class movement, Chartism in England, had reached its height between 1838 and 1842. Only then could it be seen that all past history was the history of class struggles. In Engels' words, there were new facts which forced a reconsideration of the whole previous history of humanity. It was only when, as we heard in the earlier quote from Marx, the prospect of the abolition of all classes seemed to be on the table, that all of history up until that point could be seen to have been merely different varieties of class society. So I'm going to step back and take a really wide and zoomed out view of the history now. So there's actually a footnote which was added later by Engels to the famous sentence which I started with on history being the history of class struggles, which clarifies that what was meant by this was only all of written history. The life of humanity prior to the writing of historical records is not included. So really what Marx and Engels had meant was the history of all civilization. The state which preceded this, which they had called primitive communism, was excluded. And now this is going to be extremely schematic view, very simplified, but I'm going to try and give a sort of broad overview. We could say that the mode of society that was established with the agrarian or Neolithic revolution and the transition to settled agricultural society from nomadism and hunter-gathering persisted in its sort of essential characteristics for many thousands of years. And this way of life was the basis both of kind of ancient classical civilization, Greece and Rome and whatever else, as much as it was of later European feudalism. It was only the breakdown of this traditional form of civilization and the emergence of something new that meant that the history of humanity could be seen in a new light. But it's not to Marx and Engels that we owe the conception of history as the history of modes of production, which is the kind of famous Marxist term, if you're familiar with it. For example, the feudal mode of production based on the relationship between the serf or peasant and feudal lord. This way of looking at history had already emerged as early as the 18th century, if not before. Thinkers of the Enlightenment in France and Britain, such as Rousseau, Adam Smith, and Adam Ferguson, who's lesser known, had conceived of the history of humanity in stages distinguished by differences in the way that humanity produced and reproduced itself and its world. And they had different kind of exact categories for this, but a common one was to split it into nomadism, so kind of, moving around, no settlement whatsoever. Pastoralism, which was kind of the keeping of animals. Agriculture, was settled cultivation of the land. And then finally, they kind of had these very early categories, and then the very last was commercial society, which they is what they saw the modern European society to be. The term often used by Marxists for this newly emerging commercial society was bourgeois society. And when we hear people use that term today, it's often kind of as a slur, basically. Like, if someone's bourgeois, especially amongst a certain kind of leftists, when they say that, they're just saying, they have the wrong ideas, or, they're politically, we disagree with them. Or either that, or it's just used to basically insult the rich for being rich. But when Marxists spoke of the emergence of bourgeois society, and more commonly of the bourgeois revolution, they took for granted that this event had been truly emancipatory. What I'm calling bourgeois society was something that emerged over many hundreds of years out of the ruin of feudalism, or what I've referred to as traditional society. It's a society based on the free exchange of labour. And really it's the first true society. Its emergence was a slow and largely unconscious process. Peasants were forced off the land by famine and war, and found themselves free from feudal obligations to their lords and masters. Some ended up as small landowners of a sort, with their own plots. Others found themselves with no means of subsistence beyond exchanging their labour. Alongside this, cities began to grow as centres of trade, industry, science, and eventually of wage labour. In England, in the Low Countries, which is now the Netherlands, the Italian city-states, the Hanseatic League, which would encompass Scotland, these were all sites of this urban development. And that brings us to the original sense of bourgeois, and that's urban, and it describes the residents of the towns and cities. Bourgeois society, in the way Marxists use it, is the generalization of this form of life that had grown up in the cities to society as a whole. And that doesn't mean that the world has become majority urban at this point, because it definitely hasn't. That only happens really in the 20th century. Rather, it means that the main organizing principle of society has changed to one based on free labor and the exchange of free labor, as opposed to agricultural production for subsistence by peasants who were bound to the land. It's only in the 17th and 18th centuries that this process really kicks into overdrive, and there are more or less adequate attempts to further this new form of society through political revolution. Early on, these revolutions were less conscious of what they were unleashing. They came forward in a kind of religious guise. So, for example, in the English Civil Wars or in the Dutch Revolt. It was kind of, rather than being self-conscious about what they were doing, these were kind of made in the name of mainly like extreme forms of Protestantism against the Catholic Church, even kind of sort of fundamentalist kinds of Protestantism. Nevertheless, their effects were to kind of accelerate this process. However, by the time of the Glorious Revolution in 1688 in England, liberal principles had begun to be put forward to attempt to allow this new form of society to flourish. With the American and French revolutions of the late 18th century, this becomes even more explicit. So they're more secular, they're less kind of clothed in religion. What I've been calling traditional civilization had been a civilization divided into castes or estates, and that's the term that was used in France. The first estate was the priesthood, the second estate the aristocracy, who served as warriors, and the third estate was everyone else, the mass of labourers and peasants. In the course of the French Revolution, the radical member of the clergy, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, formulated the demands of the revolution as the demand for the third estate, the workers, to be recognized as creating society and to be given the rights that they were owed. The other castes were parasites on the labouring population. They didn't contribute to society. But nevertheless, they were disproportionately represented in the political institutions of France. The third estate was nothing in the current political order, but really was already and should be recognized as everything. The revolution, like those other bourgeois revolutions that came before it, was an attempt to make the state and political institutions adequate to a new social reality, and thus to allow bourgeois society to flourish. The state ought to be made subordinate to society and to serve its development. The emergence of this new form of society was a revolution not merely in economic and social life, but also in humanity's way of understanding itself. It was this that made possible the bourgeois understanding of history in terms of modes of production. It was a projection backward onto all of history of current conditions. So the problem that Marx and Engels are dealing with is slightly different. And I just wanted to establish that they're building off of this kind of... They're not innovating completely. They're building off of this kind of bourgeois radical heritage. And so we might want to think about how what is often seen as their distinctive contribution to thought and to politics is maybe not so original after all. And maybe that's to be found elsewhere. So what Marx and Engels were dealing with was the crisis of this form of society. Bourgeois society was already a labouring society. Its ideal was that everyone should be able to make a living through their labour, and in doing so would contribute to something bigger than themselves, society. So, they thought they'd discovered, and they had discovered a kind of freedom here, right? Which meant not being dependent on, your lord and master, who gives you your means of subsistence and gives you everything, but kind of being able to support yourself in some way, and that's kind of the basis of the modern idea of the individual. An 18th century liberal thinker like Adam Smith was perfectly comfortable to say that employees should have the right to associate and combine to raise and maintain the value of their labour. That the workers should receive the proceeds of their labour was already a bourgeois ideal. What Marx and Engels recognised, amongst others, was that the industrial revolution that had begun in the 18th century, but which really only becomes apparent in the 19th, had brought this bourgeois society into crisis. And the main symptom of this for them, and the thing that they really, latched onto, was the emergence of working class socialism in the 1830s and 1840s. And to go back to anti-Dühring, the examples that Engels had given there, the revolt of the silk weavers in Lyon and the Chartism in England. In the former case, in Lyon, what began as a struggle to enforce a wage rise against the Employers' Association in the midst of economic crisis quickly developed into a political struggle for the right to combine as workers. Eventually, even the problem of seizing political power reared its head, and the workers quickly retreated. In the latter case, Chartism, it was more immediately political. So they had this document called the People's Charter, which was the list of their demands. And amongst those were secret ballot, regular elections, and universal suffrage, which at that time meant universal male suffrage, but universal suffrage. However, there are symptoms of the same problem. Proletarianized laborers were increasingly unable to participate in society through the sale of their labor. Socialism, or socialism, was the demand that bourgeois society live up to its promise. To this end, the workers organized politically as well as industrially to make demands on the state. The problems of mass unemployment, pauperism, and the crime and disease that accompanied them were well recognized across the political spectrum and came to be known as the social question. So that wasn't really the preserve of socialists alone, but everyone was kind of aware there was this new issue that had arisen. In 1848, which is quite a significant year for Marx and Engels, and I mean it's a history that's not particularly well known anymore, but there was a whole wave of revolutions across Europe. It's known as the Spring of Nations. Marx and Engels were entering young adulthood and engaging with socialism and revolutionary politics. It was at this time that the demand was made to establish the social republic, which is also called republic with social institutions. In the French Revolution of 1848, national workshops were established to provide jobs for the working class. It was the government's inability to maintain these workshops which led to a rising of the Parisian working class in June 1848, which was brutally suppressed. So Marx and Engels were in some sense supporters of this newly emerging socialist movement, but they were also its critics. So a large part of the Manifesto of the Communist Party is dedicated to criticism or critique of other varieties of socialism. And there's about, can't remember how many, 5, 6, 7, 8 different types that they outline. But the distinctions between these varieties of socialism were not based on the kind of sociological composition of the classes which were supporting them. Right? It wasn't just it's this kind of socialism because this is who votes for them, or this is who goes to their meetings. Instead, it was based on the kind of historical horizon of each of the form of politics. So, to give an example of that, feudal or reactionary socialism, which is one of the terms they use, was nostalgic for what it imagined was the more human relationships of kind of reciprocal obligation. So, between the lord and the peasant, because that did exist in some way. What they called petit bourgeois socialism wants to restore bourgeois society that I've previously described. Right? It thinks we can kind of go backwards, undo industrial production, and just make everything good again. Against all of this, Marx and Engels wanted to uphold the insight that the crisis of modern bourgeois society in industrial production also held the possibility of something greater, that is, going beyond capitalism through capitalism itself. This meant that it wasn't enough to simply support the demands of the working class for higher wages, or for jobs, or for the right to organize and strike. And to quote the Manifesto, the communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class, but in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. The immediate demands of the working class must be pushed beyond themselves. This doesn't just mean being the most radical supporters of the working class. Rather, it is based on a recognition that the demands of the working class are already the demands the working class are already making are contradictory and cannot be fully realized in capitalism. Instead, they point beyond themselves to the overcoming of capitalism. The demands of the working class reproduce capitalism. For example, and this is the topic of the chapter on the working day in Capital, the demand for shorter working hours drove the process of industrialization that led to mass unemployment. It is through the demands of the workers, demands for their bourgeois right to appropriate compensation for their labor and for the right to work, that capitalism reproduces itself. And that's not to say that workers should abandon all hope for reform or improvement of their conditions in capitalism. Historically, Marxists did not believe that the poorer and more desperate workers were necessarily more revolutionary. Nor is it to say that Marxists simply represented the most radical opposition to the status quo at all times. In her famous pamphlet, Social Reform or Revolution, Rosa Luxemburg makes the point that just as much as pure reformism, which she defines as treating the sort of achievement of immediate demands within capitalism as an end in themselves, just as much as that's a problem, so is what she calls like revolutionism, which is just constantly trying to be the most revolutionary and always calling for just the complete overthrow of everything. That would be separating the question of getting beyond capitalism from any and all immediate demands for reform. But Marxists believe that these demands would have to be taken up. The gamble that Marxism made was that it was only under the political leadership of the working class, after the seizure of state power, that it could really be shown that the working class and its demands serves only to reproduce capitalism. So what you would have is, instead of the demand for shorter working hours resulting in mass unemployment and thus conflict between workers and the destructive social and political consequences of that, instead you could consciously work through that problem. It could be seen that labour was being employed inefficiently, that much work was unnecessary and superfluous, and this would lead to a reorganisation of production and change in the ways of producing, with the ultimate goal being the abolition of wage labour itself, rather than turning everyone into a proletarian. So I'm going to stop short of talking about the development of Marxism past about, 1870, which is maybe when it gets really interesting. So to attempt to answer the question with which I titled this talk, which is, what does Marxism have to offer the working class, which I'm not really giving a very immediate answer to, right? I mean, that's kind of the premise of the whole thing, is that perhaps there isn't, perhaps there's an abuse of Marxism to walk in and say, here's what we have to offer you right now, especially at this moment in history. Marxist thought recognized historically that the working class did not need Marxism to make demands for their rights, nor did it need it to organize as workers, nor did it need it to invent socialism. Proletarian socialism had already emerged before Marx and Engels had come of age. Marxism tried to hold on to a historical perspective about the place of the working class in capitalism as a specifically modern product of the crisis of bourgeois society and the possibilities that were opened up by that. It understood that the demands of the working class were contradictory. This meant not that capitalism could not fulfill them, but that their fulfillment would inevitably be self-defeating and self-undermining. What was needed was a political act, the rule of the working class, to bring this problem to consciousness and to make it possible to work through. As Marx had written of the Paris Commune, it was the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labour. That's me. Yeah. So, I'm very keen as many hostile questions as possible.
Yeah, this right on hostilities. Go for it.
Yeah.
Take his hand.
Please explain the slogan, like the left is then
Yeah.
the left. Because that's interesting.
Okay.
Repeat the question in the mic.
So Matthias has asked me to explain the slogan, "The left is dead, long live the left." So I think there's an obvious sense in which I think something we encounter quite a lot is people will say, "Oh yeah, of course the left's dead, right? Like there's no socialist movement, there's no this, there's no that, you know, workers aren't class conscious, this kind of thing," right? And perhaps that it can go down a little bit too easily, right? So we are partly talking about, okay, clearly there's been a kind of numerical decline in you know, membership of left parties and union organisation, etc., and just sort of pure boots on the ground kind of numbers for left movements. But what we're more focused on is the left at the level of ideas. So partly what we're saying is the left is also dead at the level of ideas, and we think that's important. And that's why we do this strange project, which is mostly focused on kind of intervening in people's education, right? So we think that other things are necessary, right? We would have to rebuild a kind of workers' movement. That doesn't exist, but that's just not what we're doing. We're trying to make this intervention at an ideological level. So yeah, that's, I mean, I could go further on that, but I think that's the clarification that I'd want to make on that, is that it's partly, you know, also at the level of ideas that the left is dead. Yeah. Does that help?
A bit. A follow-up question if no one else have one.
Absolutely. Follow.
Well, I think I need to involve Johannes in this one, so we can actually answer it together. Since I don't know how the political landscape is in other countries, and I think Sweden are supposed to have a pretty strong socialistic movement, with
right?
Socialdemokraterna and Vänstern and other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, how is it? I would like to have Johannes' take on the, if it's okay for this video, like from the Swedish perspective, and gladly have one like from how it's in England.
You may need to come closer to the microphone.
I may have to,
yeah, but it should be interesting because I don't know you were from England.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't even know how your landscape is. How is the?
Okay, so I mean, do you want to go first?
No, I mean, I don't know what to say about England. That is corner.
Sure. So I mean, I think there's a fairly good analogy between the Social Democrats here and the Labour Party, right? So Patrick's. Let it be known that Patrick is sighing.
Yes. Let it be known.
What's your objection, Patrick?
I think the UK is not even maintaining the, I don't know, fake lip service looks of the left, while Sweden is still doing that.
Okay, well,
I mean,
I don't necessarily mean right now. Okay, so I would say even in the glory days of Corbynism, however many years ago, 7 years ago, I guess. I'd say there's still the same thing would hold, right? That you know, we wouldn't really understand the Labour Party even in that period as being of the left, really. No, and we probably would say the same for the Social Democrats. I mean, and maybe Johannes can say more about that because he knows more about local conditions than.
Yeah, but you didn't ask about Sweden.
Yeah.
What did you want me to?
Yeah. So you can. So I think just for the information of who are going to see it, how since we are all we are listening, we are working class in Sweden, and we only have our reality to compare to the leftist dead. But I think, how do you think the left is dead is in the Swedish terms, since there was a Patrick said that in England there's nothing compared to it.
Yeah,
Right.
I would say that I think Sweden is one of the worst countries
Okay.
in that sense, because I mean, if we compare, let's say, I mean, you can't say that unions automatically are a part of the left necessarily, but if we sort of take working class activity as a way of measuring, I would say that Sweden conditions are worse because we have no whatsoever experience of fighting and moving in Sweden. Which I would say that if you compare to England, I mean, which is also in a bad situation, but you have like the RMT. I mean, you have unions that at least
We
put
do
up
have
a fight.
we do have unions.
Yeah, exactly. You have unions that actually act as unions, which I'm not so sure we could say we have in Sweden. Not even that. And I mean, we are not really in the same corner in these discussions, but for the way I see it, I think sort of at least basic life sign activities in the working class is like one way to measure where we are. And I think in that sense, Sweden is among the worst places in Europe, at least.
Okay.
I think maybe why you say we're not in the same camp on that, or whatever you said.
Yeah. In the same
I think we broadly are, but is that I'd probably emphasize more the point that you can have a strong labour movement and still not necessarily have it be left wing, right?
Indeed.
You know, in some sense, okay, that union membership has been declining in the UK for a long time, as it has in most places in Europe, I think. Don't quote me on that, but that doesn't make it, I don't know, a revival of the unions now would, you know, they're completely tied to the Labour Party, and, you know, politically they're quite conservative, really, right? Which is part of what I was trying to emphasize in this talk, is that any sort of revived socialist movement would have to take up the labour movement in some way, but it would have to go beyond it as well, right? There's you know, there's a long history of the question of the relationship between the socialist and labour movements, and how they sort of play off against each other, and how maybe unions have a kind of they're a kind of conservativing force in some ways, which doesn't mean they shouldn't exist, definitely not, but looked at from a political perspective, it might be the case. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but go. Yes, Patrick, please.
Try. So perspectives from Sweden, Germany from my youth, and I guess US, UK, a bit from just understanding about their systems. If you position a worker movement or socialism as the aim of building a society that allows people to live free, and it's really this like aim of stepping beyond capitalism to a place that is better, because you realize that these material conditions aren't allowing us to live free. It's a race to the bottom of the barrel. It's getting worse and worse. The people who have low money, low power will have less money and less power in the future, right? Then, from that perspective, the Swedish left isn't really speaking to that. Like, I'm not seeing anything from Vänsterpartiet that says let's reclaim the companies we work in, let's re-socialize our structures. They say inte tillsa du det här med snälla, liksom, right? Like, please don't sell this school as well, please don't take away this healthcare as well, right? It's like very defensive, like please pretty please kind of situation, right? So there's no real pushback, and I'm not really seeing, and then this is not a it's not a very generous perspective, but I'm not really seeing a horizon that would speak to making this sort of change. In Germany, I don't see that either, because the German history, as I see it, or like mood, is like, oh well, you see what happens with socialism in East Germany. Do you want that? Right? It's like a bad word, really. So you don't even get to think in these terms. In the US and UK, you have two-party systems. So anything that's standing beyond center doesn't really exist in the same way as, at least in Sweden, there is something like that. But if you understand giving workers some money and some life quality as a kind of bribe, then yes, Sweden works really nicely as a bribe, because workers still do okay here in comparison to other places. For example, Germany, where young kids have it even harder to get jobs, even worse conditions, like you just take whatever you get from your boss and say thank you. Like it's even worse than here. But Sweden's development has also become very, very horrible. The separation of wealth between the rich and the poor has been at a speed that is unprecedented anywhere else. So it's getting really, really bad, really, really quickly here as well. And because nobody was there to build a worker movement here, because it was fairly okay, there's no resistance. The only thing that exists in Sweden to put up against that is, but hey, come on, please. Please don't take the schools as well. Please not the healthcare system. Please not that. And there's no real movement. So that, I think, from that perspective, yeah, the left is dead. Here, maybe I would agree with Johannes, even worse than in other places.
That's true.
One little thing, if there's a question from someone and they feel they can't articulate it in English, it's okay to say it in Swedish and we translate it.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you all. I mean, yeah. I appreciate everyone listening to me in English.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, very good.
I mean,
in terms of like,
yes, Chris, thank you.
you said about living in a classless society.
Yes.
For me, like if I'm making comparison, I'm an electrician. My father is an electrician.
Yeah.
My mum works part time.
Yeah.
My girlfriend works part time. I mean, I have 2 kids, and my mum and dad have 2 kids. Growing up, I classed myself as working class. I see myself as working class. I grew up in a fucking shithole in Liverpool. Mass unemployment. A direct comparison with our jobs and whatever, compared to where I'm living now with my 2 boys, it's a fucking world apart.
Yeah.
And I feel like I struggle to find, to even, I can't look at myself and go, oh, I'm working class. Based on the definition, yeah, I am working class. But I struggle to give myself that label. Although I'm very proud to come from a working class background.
Yeah.
I struggle to give myself that label now. Maybe that's, I feel there is a kind of like there is a classless society now, because I feel most people struggle to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I think it's quite an English perspective in a way, because the way we think about, the way we've often thought about class or been told to think about it is this kind of rigid hierarchy of kind of
Lords.
Well, no, ways you distinguish yourself socially, right? Yeah. Like these people wear bowler hats and these, you know, there's this, I don't know if you know that two Ronnies thing, where there's the guy in the bowler hat, and then, sorry, it's a horrible reference for everyone else in the room, but it's kind of like, you know, standards of dress and ways of speaking and things, right? But I think the concept of class that I'm using here, and maybe you know, it's more common to the tradition that I'm trying to get across, is very different to that. That's very like, I think that's partly a result of kind of depoliticization, that we have that concept of class, that it's kind of about these minor distinctions in what you consume and wear, and like almost, it's more like what I'd call a caste system, right? That like there's certain rules for some people and certain rules for other people. Whereas I think it wouldn't be, you know, the way I'm using the term, it wouldn't be looked at such a personal level, right? Like, just because you've had a certain level of social mobility, right? It's more about what is the kind of horizon of working class politics, as opposed to other forms of politics. Right? I think that was part of what I was trying to get across like in a very broad way,
Expand on that. What do you
right?
mean by that?
Okay.
Have some beer.
Yes, yeah, I already have. Well, I mean, I suppose one of the things to think about there is this question of an independent working class politics. So I spoke about 1848 revolutions there, which seems like absolutely ancient history, right? And what possible relevance could that have to the present day? But the reason I spoke about that is because of its significance in the history of Marxism. One of the lessons that they took away from that was basically the need for independent working class politics and independent working class organisation. And that didn't necessarily mean like, I mean, I'm not sure what it would even mean to not work with anyone who wasn't working class, because like you're saying, the boundaries are so porous, right? Like, you know, you can I don't know, you know, it's very hard to draw those lines, like in this kind of sociological way, and say, well, you know, once you earn over a certain kind of wage bracket, you're suddenly not working class, even though you're an electrician, right? You know, you wouldn't want to draw lines in that way. It's more about the dominance of a certain kind of politics, right? And leading the other kind of classes would mean taking political leadership, if that makes any sense. You know, I don't know if I've answered that adequately or not.
Was it an adequate answer, Chris?
No.
I think I lost sight of your point about classless society.
No, but I just feel like it's hard to like build a political movement when the people that you
Maybe this is what you
yeah.
before about. Oh, it's an English point of view of the situation, but like it's hard to start a movement when the people that you're trying to fight for don't see themselves as
Right.
that.
They're aspirational, yeah. They don't really want to be identified as working class.
Well, no,
because
not that they don't want to, just they don't.
They just don't,
They
yeah.
just don't see themselves as working class.
Yeah.
We're just losers in the lottery of society.
Better paid slaves.
Better paid slaves.
But I mean, working class in Sweden is like you don't want to see yourself as that. It's sort of like a victim, sort of self-victimization, right? But then, I mean, talking about, so if I understand correctly, you moved from the UK here, right? So yeah, like the situation that I think we experienced in the UK, it will happen here as well, right? That's where capitalist systems go, towards mass unemployment and crisis. We will see that the next generation, like our kids, will not be able to have the same housing. We are struggling with our payments now. That's just not like this sort of middle class illusion is going to get taken away, and we will approach what you experienced so far somewhere else already. In the meantime, of course, everybody wants to still call themselves middle class because then they can feel that even though they are 3 payments to the bank away from having their house foreclosed on, they are somehow safe in this, even though they don't own shit.
No.
Right? This is just like a real estate bubble away from bad times. Right? You can still lie to yourself about that. So how to mobilize people that would like to keep living that lie? Yeah, that's an open question. I think you would have to ask them to give it up.
Well, I think
That's the worst thing anyone can ever say to me. Call me whatever word you want, if you call me fucking middle class. Okay. Fuck you, dickhead.
Huh? Oh, pause. Have a beer.
I think it's the lack of existence of, like, you know, an actual kind of socialist movement or a working class politics that would make class a political issue, that makes this a hard discussion.
Yeah.
Right? Because
We're victims of the situation.
we're not asked, you know, it's not like we want people to already, you know, we have to have everyone already understand themselves as working class in some way, and then we can kind of have politics, right? It's like through politics that happens. That the people there's something out there which is offering this perspective, right? So it's kind of hard to debate it without the existence of that. And maybe you would want to dispute that does or doesn't exist, but I think that's what I would say.
But do you not think we're moving towards a classless society now?
In some way, yeah. In that it's hard. In that it's very difficult to perceive the existence of classes. So I think yes.
Is it though? Really?
In that sense.
Street.
Well, no, yeah, but if you use a definition, yeah, it's easy. The definition is, you're producing labour and...
No, I think Chris has a point.
The definition...
I think he really does have a point, yeah. Like, yeah, I think it's very hard to properly... It's to like... You know, you look at the Communist Manifesto and it's like, oh, the society is ever more separating into two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It's like, that's not the situation today, is it?
It makes sense in the manifesto. You can see it. If you look back in history, you can see it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And when you read,
are open, you can easily see like, okay, this is a worker, he's in working class, and who's creating society and who's not. But if you don't think in those kind of terms, it's easy just to think like, okay, I'm working, like my parents did before me. You don't think about the classes at all.
Right, but I think part of the point would be we're all. This is why I said that, you know, we're already in a kind of labouring society. We're all workers, right? Like we're not. It's not the same problem as like there's this kind of parasitic aristocratic class that sits outside and doesn't do anything.
Well, I think that still exists.
I don't know. I don't think it is the same. I don't think capitalists are aristocrats. They really did not do anything.
Just to continue on this, it's like I think it feel like wealth is more hidden now in this current society. If I want a fucking Audi R8, I can take a loan. But I don't know if someone drives in a Ferrari. Is it bought? Is it loaned? So I feel like this society is really hard to decide classes. You could actually be like, actually don't own anything, and you just have borrowed money that you live for.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd want to emphasize again that, you know, economic inequality doesn't necessarily, you know, you can have richer and poorer members of the working class, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you belong to a separate class if you're slightly better off. Like one of the things I said was, historically actually it's been the more prosperous members of the working class who have been more interested in socialist politics.
But is that because they know where they've come from?
I think partly it's having the capacity to actually, and some kind of small amount of freedom to participate in politics. I mean, if you're just absolutely destitute and sleeping on the street, you don't really have as much capacity to be like a member of a socialist party.
All time goes to survive.
Yeah, I mean that's the paradox, right? Like you sort of hit rock bottom in order to see that this lie isn't. It's just on loan. You don't own this, and it can be taken away. Then you hit rock bottom, but now it's rough to go to that meeting and organize. Right? So that's why we need to do that now, while there's a possibility to actually do that, because it's going to get worse and then it's going to get harder.
Yeah, I don't know if it's actually, wouldn't quite describe it as a paradox in that I don't think So I think, Patrick, you were said earlier about the idea that, you know, gains for the working class in capitalism are a kind of bribe, but I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, in that I don't think it's just as you get more well off, you sort of, I don't know, there's this kind of idea that, you know, as you become older and you become a homeowner, you become more conservative, right? Like this kind of thing. It's just like the sheer fact of having stuff that is a conservativing force. But I'd say it's more, there's a specifically kind of political compromise involved. Like, to be sort of entirely thinking about things in trade union terms does restrict your horizons. Do you see what I mean?
Expand on that for everyone. What do you mean by that?
Um,
What do you mean by trade union terms, and what would you mean the alternative would be?
So I suppose I'm working with the distinction here that Lenin makes between trade union consciousness and socialist consciousness. That's probably been in the background without making it fully explicit. But I think it's what I said in my talk, or the way I framed it in my talk was in terms of the kind of immediate interests and reform and you know, the ultimate goal, right? And that in some way that is introduced from outside, this idea of a goal beyond kind of immediate reforms and immediate gains within capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, your argument there makes sense to me. Like, if what you're trying to say is that, I mean, a union has its own material logics, so that is basically it's an organization that defends the interest of its constitutional sort of members and people that are part of it. This can run into issues like, for example, when the interest of the electricians that are already working here isn't the same as the electricians that arrive as refugees and would like to start working here but can't because, okay, so how do we sort this out, right? Just one example. It's not necessarily the interest of the world working class that is represented there. So there, your point of having an individual politics or the workers taking over politics, that makes sense to me because that would aim to really foreground this aim of changing the system we live in, where nothing else could necessarily do this in the same way. How to go about that, I am not sure.
Yeah.
And I think unions can definitely be something that can beat there. Like, I'm not sure, I mean, political parties don't seem to do it that well right now. Like, I don't know. Identifying as a worker is tricky though, if that identification point has been taken away or sort of been made a bad taste, right? If somebody, like the same way you seem to think about, yes, I would like to identify as a worker, I think most people in Sweden would like to think about themselves as middle class. So if you tell them that you're a worker, it's like, no, I'm not a worker. It's like, tell me, what do you think a worker is? Do you sell your labor to live? It seems like a worker. You like most of they would check all the boxes and all the definitions, but still don't want to think about themselves that way, right? Yeah. I think this is one of the projects of social democracy that sort of stated we are all middle class now. And yes, from that perspective, I'm standing behind my term pride. But yes, like, to get to your point, or to maybe the broader one, like if your aim is to change the mechanics of society to one that's oriented towards the best of humankind, right, instead of where capital would like to flow, then you need to make that the central goal of your organization in some capacity.
I think to put the point in like the most simple way is just that it may not be in your immediate interest to be a socialist.
Yeah.
That was basic. I think that was basically the one.
Take away the pride.
The one point. And that is a problem that has to be dealt with, right? How do you manage that? And how do you deal with that? But yeah, I think that's the simple the simple point. Does anyone else who hasn't yet spoken have any?
I have a question about something else.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll try and repeat this one thing.
Any example, historical example of Marxism that actually worked for a period of time?
No.
It doesn't have to be on a full nation
Repeat the question.
kind of scale, but
Yeah.
in a smaller society or a company that have a genius as a
Right.
director.
So the question was, are there any examples of Marxism working at whatever scale, whether from at a national scale or otherwise? So no. I mean that's part of where we proceed from is basically an acknowledgement that Marxism failed, but that we're also trying to kind of uphold the significance of some moments in its history. But no, I think it's kind of necessary to acknowledge that it didn't pan out. But nevertheless,
Why is that? Is it because of it cannot cooperate with capitalism? You can't have both, or
so I think
The question. For the recording.
the question is that because it can't cooperate with, it can't work, sort of coexist with capitalism. You're right. Yeah, I think that's something of it. I mean, so in Platypus we would probably uphold the Russian Revolution, 1917, but also, you know, there were other events around that period. The German Revolution of 1918, 1919, 1920.
Civil War in
Finland, Italy, Hungary. You know, there was some prospect of a kind of revolutionary wave across Europe. So in some sense, we do hold up that moment as the height of Marxism, or actually also the preceding decades when social democracy was a major force in international politics. But nevertheless, that clearly failed. Right, it turned into Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union disappeared. So, you know, it would be dishonest, and part of what we're trying to combat, I suppose, at an intellectual level is calling the defeats of the 20th century victories, which is what many, you know, what we see many leftists doing, and then trying to justify that in terms of Marxism. For example, the kind of, you know, the original perspective was kind of global, was world revolution, and that seems completely implausible and ridiculous today, because at some level it is. It's so far away from a prospect. You know, it's not really a prospect at the moment, to say the least. But part of what happened in the 20th century was that people kind of adapted to national horizons, like you were saying. So the very question of Marxism working in one country doesn't really, maybe that's a way of framing things that we've inherited from the 20th century, that Marxism is somehow about managing a national economy, when really that was never the original perspective. That was kind of a compromise with the necessities of the situation. Like, once the revolution failed to spread into Europe, there was a kind of need to think, well, what can we do within this sort of national frame to advance socialism, right? Which was changed the question entirely in some ways. But yeah, I think it's a good question because it also points out how absurdly utopian the original vision was from our perspective in the present, right? And part of what it's saying is that it makes complete sense that we would see that as crazy and utopian, but nevertheless we need to try and take it seriously because it doesn't seem like we're not sure if any better alternative has yet arisen, right? You know, we keep coming back to this topic and we keep coming back to Marxism and saying, what was that about? And like people keep trying to use it, and it's this kind of sore subject that or you know, at least some people have an interest in, and seemingly can't help having an interest in, and that's partly what we're trying to deal with.
Yeah, if I may.
You may.
To continue on that thread, I mean, so to repeat sort of what Stan is saying, that the original perspective was a global proposition. This is something that needs to be done internationally, and that was taken for granted within early Marxism and the socialist workers' labour movement, and that got lost, and it became a national thing, which is a break then from what was the original perspective. So there's a difference between them, which I think is important to keep check on, so to speak. But like the way I wrestle with this question, because like you're saying, it seems like the most utopian, far away, ever imaginable thing, that the working classes of the world would unite and take over everything, basically, in order to try to open up possibilities for a totally different world. And it sounds like a pipe dream, one could say. But then the other side of that is also like, well, what's the alternative then? This world is this the best we can have, really? And it's hard for me to imagine how we could sort of create a better world without that type of fundamental change. So I would say that without trying that, I think we will be trapped in this shit forever.
Well,
that's sort of how I think about it.
We were discussing this, Johannes, and
sorry, but sort of to believe that humanity in this world order could get to a better place without that seems to me more utopian and more pipe dreamish, so to speak, because I can't fucking see how that would ever happen.
Well, it might be the case that nobody is really concerned with that anymore. You know, we're kind of just happy to kind of chug along. I mean, I don't necessarily think that the average person has like very utopian impulses. I'm not sure if you agree with that or not.
But I think everyone dreams of freedom in some way, however distorted.
But it doesn't everyone believe that they offer it? It's not that everyone feels they offer it.
Well, people wouldn't dream about the lottery win then.
I think we are free, at some level, right? This is the whole problem, is that
it's an unfree form of freedom.
Yeah. Right, and that's kind of what I was trying to outline with this maybe slightly strange distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism. That the problem we're dealing with is a particularly modern one that comes out of, you know, a certain form of freedom that had already been established, and then what happens to that when something arises out of this society which it sort of nobody is really in control of. Like, you hear people talking about like we're kind of all enslaved to like the demands of capitalism, this kind of thing. And there is something to that perspective, I think, that it's a kind of social dynamic that, at some level we are free individuals, right? That hasn't gone away. That was a kind of like achievement of the modern age. But we're creating something that is like bigger than ourselves, that no one of us is in control of, that we're still all subject to. There's a way of thinking about like what capitalism is as a kind of social dynamic. It's not just a conspiracy of like a small group of people, of the capitalists, that they're enforcing in a top-down way on us. But in some way we're all responsible for it.
Yeah, I feel very similar to Johannes. Like, I hear your point. Like, also the question of where is it developed, or how isn't this like crazy? Like, we live in a society or in a system where you can put the people who own half the planet into a bus. That's how few they are.
I'm bombing.
That would be preferable, but like it's insane, right? It's completely nuts. We are burning this beautiful planet. It's ridiculous. So nobody looks at it or wants to take that seriously either. So the situation as it is in Sweden is still fairly okay, but it's getting worse. The project school systems will get worse and sort out those kids that have wealthy enough parents from high schools and those who don't. Not. Like, have you gone through a healthcare system? Like how the nurses are working like crazy in order to be able to make their phone calls to the cancer patients so that they even get the it's like, there's cuts everywhere. But if you have wealth, if you're wealthy enough, you can get your private doctor, right? Like these freedoms, they get taken away step by step, one defunding and one budget cut at a time, right? And until you are not free anymore, and we still have some place to fall. Like we can still drop deeper here quite a bit, but that's the direction, and I don't see that turning around at all unless we start changing the system, right? If you've been digging one direction all this time, then you need to dig up quite a bit before you can go another way. So yes, we've built all this, and we need to really think about how to rebuild that, and that's a huge task, because we've all been living in this for our entire lives, and then looking at it and be like, hey, how could this even be different? It's like, I don't even know where to, okay, let's start thinking about that, right? And I think that's necessary, because otherwise it's also a mind prison. Then at the same time you think that this is the best it could ever be, where no, it's not. It's not. There's more possible than it.
I think with the putting everyone who owns, I can't remember what was that. People who own half the planet in a bus. You could fit everyone who owns half the planet in a bus, right, and bomb the bus. I think the problem of capitalism would still persist.
Yeah, but nobody's saying that assassinations would help.
That was the point. Go back to your point. It wasn't about assassination. That was a joke, but there was a serious thing about it. The joke, but there was a serious thing about it.
The system is the problem, not the people.
Right. I mean, also. I think. We were discussing this, right? That. That we should acknowledge, like, okay, the prospect of kind of the prospect of any revolution is extremely, like, we don't want to say that it's not a kind of slightly mad and dangerous idea, right? Okay, like, I think that's people's like instinctual reaction to it, and there's a real, that is valid, right? I think it would be sort of, it's only kind of psychologically maladjusted people who would go around saying that they're like absolutely ready for everything that entails, and who would sort of fully welcome it, right? I don't think we can pretend to know that now. But the point is that, all the terrible things that could come from that, if it goes wrong, in some sense, are already happening. right? You know, we already have a major war in Europe. We already have catastrophes of various kinds. So it's like, it's kind of the flip side of this point of like, you know, is what we have any better? It's like the flip side of the like, well, is this really the best we can do? Is like, do we not already have kind of chaos of a kind and catastrophe? And that, you know, that isn't to say like, well, anything's justified, but it doesn't seem like such a horrific gamble when you think about that. It's not like things as they currently are moving along in a stable way. And I don't think you have to think that there's going to be some great sort of final crisis and the whole thing is going to collapse, because I don't think it will. I think it's going to keep reproducing itself, but it might be in more and more like sort of squalid and unpleasant ways. So, you know, why not?
Matthias has a question, but before that, I would like you to explain why would capitalism continue even if we blow up all the capitalists in a bus?
Capitalists in a bus. So I think part of what I was trying to draw out in the main body of the presentation was that, you know, it's partly the working class that reproduces capitalism, right? You know, if you're in a situation where there are people who need work, that's going to reproduce capitalism in some way. It's and that's what I meant by saying it's kind of a dynamic that's arising out of society as a whole, rather than something that's imposed on us. Like that, okay, we're all born free, but there's this kind of class of slave masters or slave drivers or whatever who've just kind of are holding us down. No, it's just, you know, even everyone is kind of responsible for it, basically. If that seems sufficient.
So you say that the working class is the problem, not the capitalist class. Could you frame it like that?
They're making the problem go round.
I don't think they're the exclusive problem, but that, you know, that.
But it's really the working class we want to get rid of, not the capitalist class, right?
True. Yeah. Overcoming the existence of the working class as the working class is the kind of ultimate goal, right? It's not to have them come out on top.
But you can't really get rid of the one without getting rid of the other.
Sure. Right.
It's like the husband and the wife. If you take away one,
the other, yeah. The categories are sort of interrelated in a way, yeah.
Matthias had a question.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that we don't actually. I haven't heard. I haven't done about what I think have been the worst decline for the working class when from like the 50s and 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
That whatever you did, you actually made profit. Even as a working class, if you even bought a house, the price you always went. You always made money on it. If we look at my grandparents, they'll have to go beat down branches from trees to get warm in the winter. And then my parents, they could, when I was born, it was like, yeah, should we buy a boat or a house? It was like the same. And now it's like, and this since actually you basically, whatever you did, you actually got more capital for the working class. And what's your take on it? Because now I think it's like we have been having it easy. Now it's been easy for the generations before us, but now it's getting uphill.
Right. You mean the kind of current situation is where
more about we talk a lot about the revolutions in the 1800s, but not like what happened when the people got it better. That's
Sure.
Yeah, people got it comfier. That's what when we started identifying. We wanted to identify as a middle class instead of working class.
Right.
Yeah, we could. Everyone could have a car. Everyone could have a house, and then life got better for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Because like fuck it, we throw everything in the ocean. We don't have to take care of it. Now it's what's the socialism take on that, like from the 50s to
Yeah.
present.
So the kind of post-war welfare state and rise in standards of living. Yeah. What's the socialist take on that? I mean, good question. I mean, I think partly part of the answer would be that the problem isn't just kind of immiseration and poverty, right? And like just pure kind of it can't just be measured in terms of standards of living. I don't think. I think that the problem is seen to be broader than that. Even though, as you pointed out, in some ways, that was something of maybe not an exception, but we're kind of going backwards from that now in a way, right? In some ways, right? You know, it's not. You know, neoliberalism is kind of a dry period, or like it's living standards have declined in Western Europe in some ways, but then at an overall level you have kind of wealth in like the third world, for example, is still kind of, you know, growing quite rapidly. So I think it would be, again, it would be kind of wrong to try and say, you know, just as much as it would be wrong to say, oh well, everything worked out fine with Marxism in the 20th century. It would also be wrong to say that capitalism doesn't produce material prosperity. But that was never really the whole problem. I think the way I've been trying to talk about it is kind of as a problem of unfreedom and the ability of individuals to live freely, but also for society as a whole to develop. And that sort of humanity's potential is being held back by this dynamic that we're not in control of. So it seems more, I think this came up in kind of the New Left in the 60s and 70s, where they were dealing with this situation of, oh, it appears that people are prosperous, right? And it can seem kind of more sort of philosophical or abstract or cheesy, right? That like to come at it from this other angle of like, oh, but we're unfree, we're alienated, and this other kind of thing. And it's not all about just sort of absolute levels of poverty, but they really did have a point there, I think. Right? They were trying to hold on to the kind of Marxist insight in a period of capitalism where it did seem that living standards were improving for a lot of people. I think that's part of the answer.
I understand a bit that, I mean, even if we got it better, we're still slaves to the capitalism and still have to work our hours.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
But I think one could say also, like, politically, there is a difference between the second make an example. There is a difference between workers organizing, fighting together for better pay and getting that, and sort of the working class given better conditions of living without them fighting for it. Because when we fight for something and we win it, it can be, not necessarily, but there is a potential for it, for us to sort of become stronger and have wider horizons and perspectives opening, and we can sort of see that we can continue somewhere. It's connected to a striving for something else. But today, let's say whatever, like a tax cut for workers, isn't in any way increasing class consciousness. So there's a difference between winning something, I would say, I don't know if you agree, and having something handed to you.
Yeah, I don't know if it... I think that's true, but I don't know if it I don't know if it answers the question, because the question is more, well, what's the problem with capitalism if it seems to be improving living standards for everyone?
Was it more like in terms of, was it this what killed the left, that the
Right.
system made it so everyone felt it got better, but in the terms of
Sure.
freedom we actually lost, we had got to spend more time away from the family and everything. It's about Patrick has to say, because you always have a good answer.
No pressure.
No pressure. Give me the answer, Matla.
I mean, like Bismarck's willingness to build insurances for workers, right? Like health insurance, like insurance and invalid insurance, like everything. They were meant to take the wind out of the sails of socialist politics, right? So that is like, here is a little bit of crumbs at the table, or even like real life improvements, so that you don't keep on these radical politics about getting able to decide, being able to decide something. Now, that has happened. At the same time, capitalism has been existing during massive improvements in our technological capacities, continued colonialist exploitation of many places on the planet, or like also inside our society, right? Like we are mostly, I mean, we can say we're mostly middle class, but we're also not here from the most hurting parts of Visby, right? Further outside in Grobo or something like that, right? So like then we have inside society these sort of structures where we have different strata, we have globally that. So yeah, we can see that capital contracts as it should in capitalism, but for a while we were still in the group that benefited.
Yeah,
sure. Right? That's not the case anymore. Like now it's getting sucked out of what we have as well, to go to like piling higher and higher on ever smaller number of shoulders. Yeah. So now we are getting to the point of, oh well, the system sucks, so everybody else who wasn't hurt by it for a long time already is like, yeah, welcome to the party. Yes, it sucks, right? And it's going to continue doing that.
Good answer. Thank you.
Friends, sorry, we will get served food very, very soon. So I think we just keep fucking quiet and we give Stan his like ending words for the recording, and then we continue over food, of course. But for the recording, is there anything else you want to say, Stan?
I would say to try and answer Matthias's question. I don't think it was the higher standards of living in the 1950s and the post-war period that killed the left. I think I'd say it was probably, when I said at the beginning that it's dead at a kind of political and intellectual and ideological level, we would trace that back at least to the 1920s, right? And the kind of, I mean, it's probably way too late in the day to open up the question of sort of Stalinism and what that means. but that was actually, the high period of Stalinism, the 1930s, was actually one of the worst periods for the working class, and hence the, and that's partly what led to fascism, right, is the Great Depression, mass unemployment, hyperinflation, right? So I think that was like one of the most catastrophic defeats for the left, and it came in a period of capitalism that was extremely harsh. So it doesn't automatically translate into success for the left when things are bad, right? So we'd always want to, in some sense, put responsibility on the left itself rather than on the objective conditions, because that can become a kind of apology for failure to the left's failures. We do like believe in the importance of a kind of subjective factor, rather than, you know, things just being the result of kind of economic conditions. I think that's to sort of bring it back to a platypus kind of point right at the end. Yeah, I think that's how I'd like to end, if no one else has. We're getting food now anyway, so we have to end. But thank you very much for your contributions and listening. It's really appreciated.
Thank you for coming. So we will be fed now, and so we will keep quiet and bribe in capitalism. We bribe ourselves, and I hope we can continue the discussions over the meal.
Sure.
Right? Yeah.
Not before I go to the toilet.
Take a piss.
Get that on the recording.